I was standing in the driveway when she said it. Not inside, not privately, out where everyone could hear. My daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed and told the neighbors, "This woman is confused. She doesn't own anything here." She said it calmly, clearly, like she was correcting a mistake. I turned to my son. He was right beside her. He didn't look at me. He nodded once. That nod landed harder than her words. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, and that's when I saw my life lined up along the curb. Black garbage bags, overfilled, split open in places, clothes shoved inside without folding, shoes mixed together, frames cracked, papers bent, things I recognized before my mind could protect me. She followed my eyes and said, "You have 1 hour to take what you can carry." 1 hour. Like I was a stranger being evicted, like I hadn't lived there. I asked what she meant. I asked how this was possible. I asked my son to tell me this wasn't real. He stayed silent. The neighbors didn't move. They watched from their lawns, their porches, their driveways. Some stared, some looked away. No one spoke. I walked closer to the bags and opened one. That's when I saw the photographs. Loose, bent, faces I knew, faces that didn't exist anymore. Then I saw the small container wrapped in an old towel. My husband's ashes, thrown in with shoes. I picked it up and felt my hands start to shake. I turned back to them, holding it out like proof that a line had been crossed. She didn't react. My son still wouldn't look at me. She said, "That's not our problem." I asked my son again, just his name, nothing else. He stared at the ground. She stepped forward and lowered her voice, but not enough. "You're embarrassing yourself." That was the moment something shifted. Not inside them, inside me. I realized this wasn't an argument. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up if I said the right thing. They weren't waiting for me to explain. They were waiting for me to leave. She pointed to the bags again and said, "Take what you need. The rest stays." I asked where I was supposed to go. She shrugged. I asked my son if he agreed with this. He said nothing. That silence wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was permission. I started pulling things from the bags, not knowing what to choose, knowing I couldn't carry everything, knowing every decision meant leaving something behind forever. Clothes slid out onto the pavement, paper scattered. I felt eyes on my back the entire time. She checked her phone and said, "You have 40 minutes now." I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just kept picking things up with shaking hands, trying to decide what part of my life deserved to survive. When I looked up again, my son had gone back inside the house. The door closed behind him. That sound told me everything I needed to know. I didn't know how long I stood there after the door closed. Long enough for the driveway to feel unfamiliar. Long enough for the neighbors to stop pretending not to watch. I focused on the bags because looking anywhere else felt impossible. There were more than I had noticed at first. Some were torn, others were soaked through at the bottom where something liquid had spilled. I knelt on the pavement and opened them one by one, trying to understand what had been decided for me. Clothes I wore every day were shoved in without care. Sleeves twisted, buttons ripped, shoes mismatched. One of my coats was inside out and streaked with dirt like it had been dragged. I didn't remember owning some of the things in there, and others were missing entirely. I found documents next. Papers folded until the creases cut through the ink. Old envelopes, a birth certificate without its folder, insurance statements, receipts, things that mattered only because they proved I existed somewhere on paper. I stacked what I could beside me, but the pile grew too fast. Every item I touched forced a decision. Take this or leave it. Carry this or abandon it. There was no time to process what I was losing, only to choose what loss I could tolerate. I opened another bag and found picture frames snapped in half. The glass was gone. The photos inside were creased, faces bent at unnatural angles. I recognized people who were no longer alive.
I recognized myself at ages I could no longer return to. I looked up once, hoping, without knowing why, that my son might come back outside. The door stayed closed. The neighbors had shifted. One woman crossed the street. A man leaned against his car. Someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. No one spoke to me. I pulled the small container with my husband's ashes closer to my body and wrapped it tighter in the towel. I didn't put it down again. As I worked through the bags, it became clear that this wasn't random. The things outside were the things that belonged to me alone. Anything shared, anything attached to the house itself, anything that couldn't be carried easily, gone. Furniture was missing. Boxes I remembered packing years ago were nowhere to be found. Items I had kept in specific places, untouched for decades, weren't here. Someone had gone through the house carefully, methodically. This wasn't rushed. That realization settled heavy in my chest. I tried to carry as much as I could, but my arms filled quickly. The weight cut into my hands. The straps of bags tore into my shoulders. I had to put things down just to breathe. Every time I set something aside, I wondered if I was choosing wrong. I kept expecting to feel anger first, or grief, or disbelief. What I felt instead was pressure, a crushing sense of urgency, like time itself had turned against me. I checked the street for a car. I hadn't planned to leave that morning. I hadn't arranged transportation. I hadn't told anyone I might need help. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but it wasn't them. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what to say. I made small piles, clothes in one, papers in another, photos stacked unevenly, shoes paired by memory instead of logic. Everything I owned reduced to decisions made on concrete. At some point, I realized I was shaking so badly I could barely grip anything. I sat down on the curb beside the bags, holding what I could, feeling the pavement through my clothes. The house stood behind me, unchanged. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn. It looked exactly as it had that morning, except it no longer belonged to me. I tried the door once, not to go inside, just to confirm. The handle didn't turn. That was when it became clear that nothing else was coming out. Whatever I hadn't taken already was staying there, permanently. I picked up what I could carry. I left the rest where it was. When I finally stepped away from the driveway, my hands were full and my life was lighter than it had ever been. And there was nowhere to go. I didn't leave the street right away. I stood there with my arms full, looking at the house, waiting for something to change, waiting for a door to open, waiting for my son to come back outside and say there had been a mistake, that this had gone too far, that it would stop. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, I set my things down and walked back to the front door. I wasn't calm. I wasn't screaming either. I knocked hard enough that there was no way it could be ignored. The door opened just a few inches. My daughter-in-law stood there. She didn't step out. She didn't invite me in. She blocked the opening with her body. "Yes?" she said. I asked to speak to my son. She said, "There's nothing to talk about." I told her I wasn't talking to her. I told her I wanted to speak to my son. I said his name loudly enough that he could hear it if he was anywhere in the house. She didn't move. She said, "You need to stop making a scene." I told her this was my home. I told her my things were still inside. I told her she had no right to do this without explaining what was happening. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "You don't own anything here." I asked her how that was possible. She didn't answer. She repeated it, slower this time, like I hadn't understood the first time. "You don't own anything here." I asked again to speak to my son. She turned her head slightly and said his name, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to let him know I was there. He appeared behind her in the hallway. He stayed several steps back. He didn't look at me. I asked him if this was true. I asked him if he had agreed to this. I asked him why my things were outside. I asked him why no one had said anything to me before today. He said nothing. My daughter-in-law answered for him. She said, "We've already discussed this." I told her I hadn't discussed anything. I told her I hadn't agreed to anything. I told her I deserved an explanation. She said, "You're getting upset again." I told her I was being forced out of my own home in front of neighbors. She said, "That's not what's happening." I asked her what she would call it then. She said, "A transition." That word landed wrong. Too neat. Too rehearsed. I turned back to my son. I asked him directly if he believed I was confused, if he believed I didn't know what I was talking about, if he believed I had no right to be there. He stared past me, over my shoulder, like I wasn't standing in front of him. I asked him one last time to tell me what was going on. He didn't answer. My daughter-in-law stepped forward and said, "You need to take your things and go." I told her I wasn't leaving until someone explained why this was happening. She said, "We don't owe you anything." I asked her how she could say that. She said, "Because this is our house now." I asked how that could be true when I was still alive, when I had never agreed to give it away, when my name was still attached to everything that mattered. She didn't respond to any of that. She said, "You're causing stress." I looked at my son again. I asked him if he was going to let her speak for him. I asked him if this was what he wanted. He shifted his weight. He sighed. And then he said the first words he had spoken since coming to the door. "Please don't do this here." That was all. Not a denial, not an explanation, not a defense. A request for me to stop. My daughter-in-law immediately said, "You see, this is exactly what we're talking about." She told me I was being unreasonable. She told me I was upsetting everyone. She told me I needed to accept that things had changed. I asked what had changed. She said, "Everything." I asked, "When?" She said, "That's not your concern." I told her I wasn't leaving without my remaining belongings. She said, "Those aren't yours anymore." I asked who decided that. She said, "We did." I waited for my son to object. He didn't. That was when I understood that I wasn't standing in front of two people having a disagreement. I was standing in front of a decision that had already been made. They weren't arguing with me. They were managing me. I picked up my things from the porch where I had set them down. I told my son if this was his choice, he would have to live with it. He didn't respond. My daughter-in-law closed the door slowly, deliberately, while I was still speaking. The lock clicked. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again. It didn't.
I didn't go far after that. I sat in my car with my things piled in the back seat, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the house through the windshield. I wasn't thinking clearly yet. I was still expecting something to reverse itself. After a while, I tried calling my son. It rang until voicemail. I tried again, straight to voicemail. I sent a text, just his name, nothing else. No response. I waited a few minutes and tried the house phone. It rang, then stopped. No answer. I drove around the block and came back, like that might change something. The house looked the same. The curtains were still drawn. No movement. No sign that anyone inside cared whether I was still there or not. I tried the door again. Locked. I tried the side entrance. Locked. I went around back, stepping carefully like I didn't belong there anymore. The back door was locked too. The windows were shut. I pressed my face close to the glass and could see familiar furniture inside. My chair, the table I used every morning, everything exactly where it always was. Except me. I knocked once more, quieter this time. Not angry, not demanding, just to be heard.
No answer. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no messages. That was when it began to sink in that this wasn't about one moment in the driveway. This was about access, control, permission. I realized I couldn't get back inside to use the bathroom. I couldn't get a glass of water. I couldn't retrieve my medications if I had left them behind. I couldn't even sit down in my own living room to collect myself. Every basic thing required permission now, and I had none. I tried calling again later that evening. This time, my daughter-in-law answered. I said my son's name. She said, "He's busy." I asked when I could come back to get the rest of my things. She said, "There's nothing left for you here." I told her there were still items inside that belonged to me. I told her I hadn't been able to carry everything. She said, "That was your choice." I told her I needed my documents, my records, things that couldn't be replaced. She said, "You should have thought of that earlier." I asked if my son agreed with this. She said, "You don't need to involve him." I asked her to put him on the phone. She said, "This conversation is over." The line went dead. I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at the screen, waiting for it to ring back. It didn't. That was the moment I understood that I had been fully shut out. Not temporarily. Not until emotions cooled. Completely. I tried one more time the next morning. No answer, no response, no acknowledgement that I still existed. I drove back to the house again, hoping, against everything, that maybe I could catch my son outside alone. The driveway was empty. His car was gone. Her car was there. I didn't get out of the vehicle. I already knew what would happen. I sat there long enough to see her come out with a trash bag. Not my things this time, just trash. She tossed it into the bin, glanced down the street, and went back inside without looking at my car. That hurt more than anything else had so far. I wasn't being argued with anymore. I wasn't being corrected or confronted. I was being ignored. Ignored like someone who had already been removed. I checked my phone again. No messages. By the end of that day, it was clear that there would be no explanation, no conversation, no chance to recover what I had left behind. Access was gone. Communication was gone. Authority was gone. Everything that tied me to that house had been cut cleanly and quietly. And the worst part was knowing that every door I tried after that day would stay locked, because the decision to shut me out had already been made. That night didn't have a plan attached to it. I drove until the streetlights blurred together, and the weight in my chest made it hard to breathe. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't go back to the house. I pulled over more than once just to sit and steady myself. My hands kept shaking. My shoulders ached from carrying bags that now sat useless in the back seat. Everything felt temporary. The car, the silence, me. I parked in a quiet lot and sat there longer than I should have, staring at nothing, replaying the driveway in my head. Her voice, his silence, the way the door closed, the sound of the lock. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I realized then that I hadn't eaten. I hadn't used a bathroom. I hadn't taken my medication. All the small, normal things that anchored my day had been taken away along with the house. When I finally found somewhere to stop, it didn't feel like rest. It felt like hiding. I carried my bags inside one by one, counting them, making sure nothing had been taken while I wasn't looking. I lined them up against the wall like they were proof of something. I went through them again, slower this time, not to organize, to confirm what was gone. Things I had used every day weren't there. Items I had kept in the same place for years were missing. It became clear that what I had taken wasn't what mattered most. It was what had been left behind. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding my husband's ashes, trying to decide where to put them. There was nowhere that felt right. Nothing felt permanent enough. I kept them close instead. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made me tense. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the driveway again, the bags, the neighbors' faces, the way my daughter-in-law had spoken like she was correcting a problem. I woke up early, disoriented, reaching for things that weren't there. I expected to hear familiar sounds, the house settling, the morning routine. Instead, there was nothing. That absence followed me everywhere that day. I moved through the hours slowly, realizing how much of my life had been tied to that house without me noticing. My mail, my records, my routines, even my sense of time felt broken. I avoided looking at my phone, but I checked it anyway. Still no message, no explanation, no acknowledgement. The humiliation didn't fade. It stayed close, replaying itself whenever I stopped moving. I kept imagining what the neighbors were saying, what they thought, whether they believed her, whether they thought I was confused, whether they thought I had done something wrong. That thought settled deep and stayed there. I felt smaller everywhere I went, like I was taking up space I hadn't earned, like I needed permission to exist in places that weren't mine. The practical problems stacked up quickly. I didn't have access to everything I needed. I couldn't replace what I didn't have proof of. I couldn't explain what had happened without sounding unstable. How do you say your own child locked you out and threw your life into garbage bags? I rehearsed the words in my head and abandoned them every time. I tried to distract myself by unpacking what little I had, but it only made the loss more visible. Half-empty drawers, missing pairs, objects without context. Everything felt like fragments of a life that had been interrupted. I kept thinking about the house as if it were still waiting for me, like if I just showed up at the right time, the door would open and this would be explained. That thought lasted until I remembered the locked handle, the blocked calls, the flat finality of her voice. By the second night, the weight of it all pressed harder. The shock had worn off just enough for something worse to settle in. This wasn't temporary discomfort. This was displacement. I wasn't visiting somewhere else. I wasn't between plans. I had been removed. That realization changed the way everything felt. The room I was in didn't feel like shelter. It felt like evidence of how completely I had been pushed out. I sat alone with my things spread around me, trying to figure out what came next without having any authority to decide it. Every option felt uncertain. Every path felt blocked. And through all of it, the silence from my son stayed unbroken. That silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't delay. It was the confirmation that this was my new position in his life, outside, unheard, and already adjusted to by everyone else. It took time for the truth to settle, because at first, I kept treating what happened like a shock that would wear off, like something caused by stress or misunderstanding, like an argument taken too far. But the days passed and nothing changed. No call, no explanation, no correction. That's when I started to see the pattern. I replayed every moment in the driveway again, not as something happening to me, but as something done on purpose. Her words had been prepared, calm, certain. She hadn't been improvising. She had been executing something already decided. And my son's silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It wasn't him being caught in the middle. It was alignment. He had stood there while she spoke for him. He had watched while my belongings were treated like trash. He had let the neighbors hear that I didn't belong. And when it mattered most, when one word from him could have stopped everything,
he had chosen not to use it. That choice stayed with me. I realized then that I had been addressing the wrong person that day. I had kept looking to my son for answers, expecting him to intervene, to explain, to take control of the situation. But he had already given control away. She didn't overpower him. She didn't force him. She didn't act without his consent. She spoke because she had permission to speak. She acted because he allowed her to. Every time she said we, she meant him. That was difficult to accept because it meant the betrayal didn't start in the driveway. It had started earlier, quietly, without my knowledge. Decisions had been made about my place in that house before I ever realized my place was in question. I thought about how organized everything had been, the way my belongings were separated, the way access was cut off immediately, the way communication stopped completely. None of that happens by accident. That kind of removal requires agreement. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the humiliation wasn't a byproduct. It was part of the process, making it public, making me look unstable, making sure no one questioned their authority. If the neighbors believed her, then my absence would make sense. If they believed I was confused, then my disappearance wouldn't raise questions. That wasn't emotional. That was strategic. I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong and started asking a different question. When did they decide I was no longer needed? That question changed everything. It explained the lack of urgency, the lack of guilt, the way my son avoided eye contact. He wasn't conflicted, he was resolved. I realized that I had been holding on to the idea of my son as someone who would protect me, even when the evidence said otherwise. Letting go of that idea hurt more than being locked out of the house, because the house was just a place. His silence was a position. Once I saw that, the situation stopped feeling chaotic and started feeling deliberate. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with conversation. I was dealing with a decision that had already been finalized, and I wasn't meant to be part of it. That understanding didn't bring relief. It didn't bring clarity in a comforting way. It brought something heavier. It told me that everything I was experiencing, the isolation, the loss, the humiliation, was not an accident or an emotional overreaction. It was the result of being quietly removed from a life I thought I still belonged to. What followed wasn't loud. There were no more confrontations, no dramatic scenes, no arguments to replay. What followed was quieter and harder to escape. Every day after that felt shaped by what had happened in the driveway. I noticed it in small ways first, when I reached for things out of habit and remembered I no longer had them, when I started to write something down and realize the papers I needed were still locked inside a house I couldn't enter, when I thought about mail arriving somewhere I no longer belonged. The separation wasn't just physical, it crept into everything. I stopped checking my phone as often because the silence was starting to feel intentional, not forgotten, not delayed, chosen. Each unanswered call reinforced the same message. There was no place for me in their routine anymore. I became careful about where I went, about how long I stayed, about what I carried with me. I didn't have a base anymore. Every place felt temporary. Every interaction felt like it required explanation I didn't want to give. I noticed how often my thoughts circled back to the house, not because I wanted to return, but because so much of my life was still anchored there. Memories, documents, proof of decades lived in one place, all of it cut off at once. The humiliation followed me more closely than I expected. It showed up in conversations I avoided, in streets I no longer drove down, in the way I imagined my name being spoken when I wasn't there. I wondered what story had replaced me. Had she told people I moved out willingly? That I had been confused? That I had agreed to leave? The idea that my absence had been explained without me made my stomach tighten.
I thought about the neighbors often, about what they had seen, about what they might believe, about how easily one version of events could erase another. That day had rewritten me in other people's eyes. The practical consequences deepened as time passed. Without access to what I had left behind, even simple tasks became complicated. I couldn't retrieve records, I couldn't confirm details, I couldn't move forward cleanly. Every solution required cooperation I didn't have. I caught myself still thinking in terms of when this gets resolved, as if there were a meeting coming, a conversation that would reset everything. That belief lingered longer than it should have. Then, one afternoon, I drove past the house without meaning to. The driveway was empty. The curtains were open. The place looked lived in, normal, as if nothing had happened, as if I had never stood there with my life in bags. That image stayed with me. They had adjusted quickly. I hadn't. I began to understand that what hurt most wasn't just the loss of the house or the belongings. It was the ease with which I had been removed, the speed at which my absence had been absorbed into their lives. No questions, no hesitation, no visible impact. I replayed the moment my son closed the door again and again, not because I wanted to punish myself, but because that was where everything changed. That was where the relationship shifted from strained to severed. From that point on, there was no shared reality anymore. They were moving forward without me, and I was left carrying the weight of an event that no one else seemed interested in revisiting. That day didn't end when I left the driveway. It followed me into every quiet moment after. It shaped how I saw myself, how I trusted, how I understood my place. The shadow of it stretched far beyond the house. It settled into my life and stayed there, reminding me daily that what was taken from me wasn't just property, it was belonging.
I still see the driveway when I'm not expecting to. It comes back in quiet moments, without warning. The angle of the sun, the way the bags were lined up, the sound of her voice carrying just far enough for others to hear, the way my son stood behind her, already removed from me. Nothing about that day ever corrected itself. There was no follow-up, no explanation delivered later, no moment where someone acknowledged what had been done. The silence stayed intact, like it was part of the plan. I learned to stop expecting answers. Not because I understood them, but because waiting for them only deepened the loss. The house continued to exist without me. Life inside it went on. Whatever version of the story replaced me didn't require my presence or my agreement. I wasn't invited to clarify anything. I wasn't asked to participate in the ending. I had already been edited out. I thought, for a long time, that the hardest part would be losing the home, the rooms, the objects, the sense of place. But those losses had edges. They were concrete. They could be named. What stayed with me was harder to define. It was knowing that my removal had been clean, that no one had looked back, that the decision had held. Every door I didn't knock on after that wasn't restraint. It was recognition. Recognition that the position I once held no longer existed. Recognition that trying to step back into it would only repeat the same outcome. The driveway never offered closure. It never softened with time. It never transformed into something understandable. It simply remained the point where everything stopped. I didn't get justice. I didn't get reconciliation. I didn't get an explanation that made sense. What I got was certainty. Certainty that when they chose to close that door, they meant it. Certainty that my presence was no longer required for their lives to continue. Certainty that what happened wasn't temporary, emotional, or unresolved. It was final. I carry that with me now, not as a lesson, not as wisdom, not as something to forgive, but as a fact that shaped what came after. The house is still there. The driveway still exists. The door still closes the same way. And somewhere inside, life continues exactly as planned, without me.